Hi guys, welcome to a lesson about thesis statements. Um, Thesis statements are difficult for a lot of people, and one of the ways that teachers make thesis statements less difficult is by giving kind of a formula for how to write thesis statements. um, and those often are fine, um, but we're looking to kind of elevate our thesis statements to the next level. So what I'm going to do today is give you a strategy for taking maybe what you've become accustomed to with thesis statements and making them better by giving you a new formula that eventually, hopefully, you'll be able to um, break and move beyond um, and really kind of shine with your own ideas. So let's start by looking at what we've already been taught about thesis statements. My guess would be that most of you have been taught something similar to this about thesis statements in the past. Um, the point of a thesis statement is to reveal an original thought or idea, to set yourself apart from other people, to be able to say, I'm not just regurgitating what I've been told about a thing, but that I'm actually able to formulate my own thoughts about this thing and say something new about it. So if we look, let's imagine that we were being asked to write a paper about Mr. Lassard's AP language class. And based on what we have known about thesis statements in the past, if the question was, what does Mr. Lassard teach in AP language? You might then formulate, if that was the prompt, then you might formulate a thesis that looks something like this example that we have over here on the right. And this example basically follows the old standard formula where you start off with, in this document, or in the case of my example in my class, the author, or in my case, the teacher, uses blank, 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 and you usually list off three things in order to accomplish blank. So if the question is, what does Mr. Lassard teach in his class? Then what you end up doing is saying, in AP language and composition, Mr. Lassard covers topics such as rhetorical analysis, argumentation, and synthesis in order to prepare students for the test in May. And that's probably pretty close to how you in the past have been taught to formulate a thesis. It's just basically regurgitate part of the prompt, fill in a blank for the prompt, like, oh, what is he teaching? Oh, he's teaching us for the test, and here are the three things that he teaches us. And then you can write that paper where you've got that introduction, and you say, okay, here's the evidence that he teaches rhetorical analysis, blah, 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 blah. Here's the evidence that he teaches argumentation, blah, blah, blah. Here's the evidence that he teaches synthesis, yada, 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 and then conclude. And then it's obvious that he's teaching you for the to be ready for the test in May. It's just obvious. Now, this is not a good thesis. It may have been good in the past for you to be able to say, yep, okay, like this is what's going to be in my paper, but it doesn't really say anything new. It makes you look, it doesn't make you look good, or it's not going to be good enough for the future. Let's put it that way. It may have been good enough for the past. It's no longer good enough for what you want to be able to do in the future. And it comes back to this idea that there's no original thought there, right? It's a regurgitation of what we already know. Because of that, it's boring, right? Who wants to read this paper? Nobody wants to read this paper. Nobody wants to write this paper, especially if you're already in the class. Like, what is the point here? There's no point, right? If you're sitting through it, through the class, then there's no reason to do it. to write it, right? I guess if you're trying to explain the class to somebody else, then maybe, but otherwise, there's no point to this paper. It's not really saying anything that the prompt didn't already tell you, like Mr. Lassard is going to teach you skills and you are going to be ready for the test in May. Really, I mean, like that comes down to the very basics of the class, right? Like we would just kind of expect it. If the prompt didn't say it, we would already mostly expect these things anyway, right? So therefore, there's no risk here. There's nothing. Like you're sticking to what's obvious in this paper. If you were to write this paper, there's no risk, and without risk, I've already kind of implied that there's no original thought or idea. We're just kind of circling the drain, right? Like the drain is just like same old, right? And that makes it unsophisticated. And what you really want is to be able to show that you have sophisticated thought. So how are we going to move beyond this then? I'm going to set a new standard for you. The new standard is going to propose a new formula for your thesis statement, whereas the old formula was, introduce the background information, list 3 things that you're going to cover, tell us why those things are important. This new formula is much more open-ended, so you're going to have to bear with me for a second. Here's the new formula. Although, fill in concept that the document is responding to. In this case, let's imagine that the document is the class, just because that's the example that I was using in the previous one. So the question is the same. What does Mr. Lassard's AP language class teach students? So imagine that the document is the class, but it might be a book, it might be a an essay. In this case, we'll use the class. So although concept that the document is responding to. Well, what's a concept that the class is responding to? I have to figure that out. Still, concept that the document proposes. Well, what is the class proposing? I don't know. I have to figure that out. Therefore, concept concerning the author's overall purpose. Well, what is Mr. Lassard's overall purpose? I have to figure that out. So all of a sudden you have 3 things that you have to figure out before you can write this thesis. You have to figure out what's the class responding to, what's the class proposing, and what is Mr. Lassard's purpose overall. All of those are very open-ended questions compared to the previous thesis. So let's imagine that Yoda over here has taken my class. Not that he would need to, but he has. And now he's being asked to write this paper using this new standard of thesis. And this is what Yoda has come up with. Although past thesis statements generally showed unsophisticated ideas, advanced theses can reveal complex thoughts. Therefore, Mr. Lassard encourages students to take risks when forming their thesis statements. So Yoda has gone in the direction of thesis statements, and he's saying, all right, this class is responding to the concept of unsophisticated ideas. This class is also proposing the idea that complex thought is better than unsophisticated ideas, essentially, right? So in this case, he's saying, although still advanced theses. I left off the still because it was a little awkward in the way that I wrote this. But you can still see that they're bouncing off of each other. So the final part of the thesis, therefore, what's Mr. Lassard's overall purpose in this case? Mr. Lassard's overall purpose is to encourage students to take risks when forming their thesis statements. Is somebody else going to take these 3 exact concepts from this class and write this paper? No. But is this a legitimate way to answer the question, what's the purpose of AP literature? Sure. Can it be proved? Yeah, it can be proved, or hopefully it can be proved. And it's, you know, it's a new way, it's an original way to think about the class. It shows that like there's been a digging down into three unique concepts or ideas about the class: unsophisticated ideas versus complex thoughts leading to the taking of risks. Those are big ideas that can be elaborated on in quite a few ways. So this is why this thesis makes you look much better. It's intriguing. Well, what are these concepts of unsophisticated ideas and complex thoughts and taking risks? What can be said about it? In what ways are those things going to happen? It's just much more interesting for somebody to want to write about and or want to read about. Is it the most interesting thing in the world? Maybe not. Is it way more interesting than just saying, well, first we're going to talk about these three things, and then you'll be ready for the test in May? It is more interesting than that. It sets you apart from the people who are getting stuck in prompt land, those people who are just going to regurgitate the part of the prompt back in their thesis and in their paper, you know. But it still is grounded in the type of evidence that you would need in this case from the class. In the case of if you were writing this about an actual book or essay or speech, you would be using rhetorical evidence to prove it. In this case, you could use, you know, evidence from the class to prove this thesis. So it essentially still allows you to use relevant evidence to prove it. It's compelling you to take intellectual risks because you have to come up with those concepts on your own, rather than just regurgitate what's already clear from the document that you're writing about. And then finally, it makes you look good because if you pull this off, you sound far more sophisticated and far more intelligent than just the regurgitation, right? The regurgitation of things from the document. You're actually interpreting and analyzing things from the class or analyzing things from the document in that case. And it still allows you to write a fairly structured paper here, right? Like you've still got a paper in three parts, three main parts essentially, with an introduction and conclusion at the end, but far more open-ended in how you explore those parts. So the first major part of the paper, you know, it's Roman numeral 2, but you know, first major part of the paper would be about unsophisticated ideas from the old models of thesis. You'd have to provide evidence and elaborate on how that evidence is, you know, showing unsophisticated ideas. The second part of the paper then allows you to move into complex thoughts that are possible in the new model. And you'd have to provide evidence of those complex thoughts, and you'd really have to dig in to find and elaborate on that evidence. And then topic 3 is the third major part of the paper is even much more kind of open-ended in how you're going to explore this idea of taking risks, right? How are risks being taken? What kind of evidence can I provide to show those risks are being taken? How am I going to elaborate on the facility and the benefit of those risks? All of this is far more complicated and interesting than just saying, here are the 3 topics you'll cover, and in the end, this is what you'll learn from it, but really kind of digging deeper into that. So let's look at one final example now. I talked very broadly about how the document in the previous example was basically just the class, right? Like I used the class as an example. But let's get a little bit closer to what a rhetorical analysis example would look like. So in the old model, a rhetorical analysis of this particular lesson, like how I'm using language in this particular lesson, or how I attempt to use language in a particular lesson, might look would look something like this. Mr. Lassard's rhetoric uses corny jokes, outdated pop culture references, and a monotonous tone of voice to convey new ideas about thesis statements to his audience. So that old model is, again, it's just pointing out obvious things, right? I'm going to write a paragraph about his corny jokes. Then I'm going to write a paragraph about his outdated pop culture references. Then I'm going to write a paragraph about his monotonous tone of voice. And then I'm going to tie it all back to his very obvious purpose, which is to convey a new idea about a thesis statement. But there's nothing new there, right? Anybody who's watched this lesson is gonna get that, right? Like they're not gonna learn anything from this. They don't need you to prove that to them. You could still write the paper, but why? Whereas if you were to write this, although individuality is often elusive, struggling can be original. Uh, Struggling to be original has impressive benefits. Therefore, Mr. Lassard embraces his passions in order to convey a new method of expression to his audience. So in this case, we've had to dig in. What are those concepts? The concept of individuality, the concept of struggling for originality, the concept of embracing passions, those I had to figure out for myself. Can they still be proven by what I'm doing here? Yes. So let's look at what this new paper would look like. First, you'd have your introduction with your thesis statement, sure, whatever. But then the next part of your paper, the first major part of the paper, would cover the elusiveness of originality. Now, here's the tricky thing. Here's the new thing. We can look at that old thesis and see what originally we had been proving can now become types of evidence to prove it. So the elusiveness of individuality, I could use the monotonous tone of voice from the old thesis as now evidence to prove this much more complex thought. And then you would elaborate on the rhetorical impact of the monotonous voice in order to prove the elusiveness of individuality. The second part, similar deal. Explore this concept of benefiting from the struggle of originality, right? You can use the types of things you were going to talk about from the first thesis, corny jokes and outdated pop culture references, to help prove, to elaborate and help prove on the benefit of struggling for originality, the originality of corny jokes and the originality of pop culture references and the benefits that those bring. All of a sudden, there's much more depth to that very simple idea from the original thesis. And then the third topic, embracing passions, where you're synthesizing parts 1 and 2 and really drawing the ideas there together, perhaps bringing in a few more pieces of evidence to elaborate on, the importance of embracing new passions. And then finally concluding and pushing the audience forward into this new line of thought and like this new idea about, where do we go from here? How do we take this information and make it useful to ourselves? This is the kind of thing that we're looking for. Now, I understand, and I'm getting ready to wrap up here. I understand that what I was saying about evidence and elaboration may still be fairly elusive to you. You may still be confused about it. And if that's the case, I want you to trust me that we are going to cover evidence and elaboration more thoroughly in a future lesson. So if what I was trying to say about evidence and elaboration was a little bit confusing to you here, focus more on the thesis, what I was saying about the thesis statement, and try to wrap your head around that. And worry more about the evidence and elaboration a little bit later. So what we're going to do now is we're going to practice writing a complex thesis with a couple of the things that we've already read. And we'll see how we do, and we'll tweak it as needed. But please come to class prepared to share your work on this.